All right, welcome everybody here and online. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways on which we gather. Today we pass through the lands of the Camaragal peoples who have cared for this country for countless generations. We thank and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and recognise their enduring connection to the land, sea, sky and community. We honour their wisdom, culture and resilience. And welcome back to the 2026 season of our HDR student milestones. And today is, of course, the first one. And we kick it off with one of our upcoming superstars, Tegan Rare. No pressure, Tegan. And in the starting lineup today for her CoC panel, experts Dr. Bridget Booker, who's also here in person, and Dr. Kim Ralston. Thank you very much for coming. And they're led most confidently by Associate Professor Taryn Sanders, who's chairing today's CoC. And also acknowledge Tegan supervisors, Associate Professor Teresa Diggy, Dr. Carmel Patterson, who are all led by, of course, Dr. Geek Tajali Basro, who has made a special appearance today. Thank you very much for coming in today, Geek. And also acknowledge Belinda Gudis, who is Tegan's Associate Supervisor and User. So without any further ado, Tegan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Ricky. So my thesis is titled Improving Student-Teacher Relationship Quality, Integrating Evidence and Practice Perspectives. It is based on the rather intuitive notion that we want school-aged children to have positive relationships with their teachers.
Okay.
Empirically, we know that student-teacher relationships, or STRs, represent a promising leverage point in that STRs are consistently and positively linked to academic, behavioural and socio-emotional outcomes for students and to important teacher outcomes like wellbeing and job satisfaction. In part, the breadth of this evidence has prompted intervention research looking at how STRs can be improved. Now, despite the emerging body of work, we still have quite limited knowledge on some important what, why, and how questions. So what are the active ingredients making STR interventions effective? Why do these practices work? And how can they be implemented and sustained in everyday teaching contexts? In essence, this project aims to answer these questions and begin bridging the research to practice gap. So study one will address the what and why through a meta-analysis with metasynthesis. Study 2A will address the why and how through a multi-stakeholder survey. And study 2B will integrate this evidence through a co-designed practical toolkit and implementation framework for improving STRs in Australian secondary schools. So before getting into those studies in more detail, we need to have a good conceptualization of what STRs are. According to Robinson, STRs are ongoing social processes between students and teachers, including their feelings towards each other, interactions over time, and perceptions of each other and the relationship itself. When we then think about the quality of STRs, we can draw upon attachment theory. So accordingly, STRs are co-constructed dyadic attachment-based relationships. By attachment-based, I mean that STRs can function similarly to the child-parent relationship, in that a high-quality relationship would be one where the teacher provides a safe base and students feel safe, supported, and confident to engage at school. From a measurement perspective, we typically consider STR quality through the dimensions of closeness, conflict, and dependency. So a high quality STR would be high on closeness and low on conflict and dependency. Together, this tells us that STRs are ongoing, they are co-constructed, and they are dyadic. But we also need to consider the context in which these STRs develop, as well as the mechanisms that maintain them. So developmental systems theory gives us a nice framework to look at context. At the individual level, Developmental systems explains that characteristics of both students and teachers, including their prior experiences and social emotional capacities, shape expectations for interpersonal relationships and therefore STRs. At a level above the dyadic STR, we know that multiple STRs can exist at a classroom level. So if we think of classrooms as small social systems, multiple STRs can interact and contribute to shared features like the classroom climate. And these features then reciprocally shape the individual dyadic STRs. At the most distal level, we also know that STRs are shaped by institutional, social, and cultural contexts, but these contexts shape STRs indirectly. So for example, the extent to which relationship building is prioritized within a school, whether through professional learning, leadership priorities, or the school culture in general, all likely shapes how teachers' capacity and motivation to invest in these relationships with students. This brings us to a third important consideration, motivation. So self-determination theory is a useful framework to look at motivation because it helps explain how STRs are a key relational mechanism that support both student and teacher psychological needs. So for teachers, STRs can be competent, supportive, and signal that they are effective in their role. And STRs are also inherently relatedness supportive. Most importantly, when teachers' psychological needs are supported, they are then more likely to engage in need-supportive behaviours. So things like allowing for student voice, providing structured feedback, or general emotional responsiveness to students. These need-supportive behaviours reinforce both STRs and also support students' own need satisfaction. So collectively, these theories give us a really nice overall framework for intervention research. Attachment theory explains how STRs are conceptualized and measured. Developmental systems explains that STRs are embedded within and shaped by interacting individual and contextual factors. And self-determination theory helps to explain the mechanisms that maintain STRs. This conceptual work has not yet been fully translated into intervention research. As a brief summary of what's already been done, there are 2 existing syntheses of STR interventions, and we can use this multi-tiered pyramid as a heuristic for organising interventions based on their level of individualisation. So Kincaid colleagues conducted a meta-analysis of Tier 1 programs and also categorised programs based on the types of relationship practices or active ingredients involved. So this gave us some preliminary insights into potential mechanisms for improving STRs. Pauling and colleagues then narratively reviewed Tier 1 and Tier 2 programs and developed a conceptual framework of approaches to improving STRs, which consists of increasing closeness, reducing conflict, social emotional learning, and relationship-driven classroom management. Now, based on what we know about how STRs are conceptualized, how they are shaped by context, and the mechanisms that maintain them, there are several evidence gaps here. Firstly, all studies in Kincaid's meta-analysis and 3/4 of those in Pauling's review used a teacher-reported measure for STRs. So comparatively, we know quite little about students' perspectives on these programs. Secondly, based on developmental systems, we know that STRs are shaped by individual and contextual factors. However, the prior reviews haven't yet explored any heterogeneity. And as a final consideration, these prior reviews have paid quite little attention to implementation. We know already from implementation research that effectiveness alone doesn't ensure the feasibility, acceptability, or sustainment of these practices in schools. particularly for STR intervention research, without understanding how students and teachers, as the expected implementers and receivers of the programs, actually experience them, it is difficult to identify what kind of supports and strategies might be needed for implementation success. So, addressing these gaps, the current project adopts a multi-phase explanatory sequential mixed method design. Essentially, quantitative evidence informs and is extended qualitatively. So this begins with study 1, a systematic review and meta-analysis with meta-synthesis. So study 1 will synthesize the quantitative and qualitative evidence, providing a more comprehensive overview of STR intervention, and also addressing what works for whom, in what context, and why. So this involves 2 quantitative research questions and 1 qualitative. For the quantitative questions, study 1 primarily involves a meta-analysis, then with moderation analysis to explore heterogeneity. The moderation analyses will focus on 3 main areas. Firstly, contextual moderators, so things like the education level or target population, will be assessed to identify potential enablers and barriers to program effectiveness across different settings and populations. Secondly, the relationship practices involved in interventions will be coded as active ingredients to assess whether certain active ingredients are associated with stronger intervention effects. And finally, we'll also look at methodological factors as moderators. For the qualitative research question, which essentially provides the explanatory why, study 1 also involves a meta-synthesis of qualitative evidence. So given that we have a lack of student-reported data and implementation insights, study 1 will use qualitative evidence to integrate both student and teacher perspectives on what makes certain programs effective. In terms of progress for study 1, we have pre-registered the protocol on OSF. Briefly, the review will involve intervention studies in primary and secondary populations that explicitly aim to improve STRs. After multiple rounds of refinement, we also have the search terms for the review. And based on some pilot searches, I expect somewhere between 10 to 12,000 records after deduplication. We will be using the machine learning tool AS Review for title and abstract screening and AN for full text. And the main domains for data extraction are mapped out, as you can see here. For evidence synthesis, the quantitative evidence will be synthesized using a multi-level meta-analysis if we have 3 or more studies that meet the criteria. And moderation analysis will be performed where there are 2 or more effects per level of a moderator. In parallel with this, our qualitative evidence will be synthesized using Braun and Clark's 6-phase process for reflexive thematic analysis. So, as a summary of study 1, it aims to consolidate the international quantitative and qualitative evidence, providing an overview of evidence-based programs and practices, as well as some qualitative insights into potential mechanisms and implementation processes. This evidence informs and is then extended in study 2 through 2 sequential phases. So, as I mentioned earlier, the effectiveness of evidence-based practices alone doesn't ensure meaningful impact in real-world settings. Implementation research has therefore developed frameworks like the IPPE framework that help to systematically guide the translation of practices into applied contexts. So, building on study 1, study 2 focuses on the first 2 phases of IPPE, exploration and preparation. In the Australian school context more broadly, the first step of exploration, identifying a need, has largely already occurred. So across some national and state educational guidance, STRs are positioned as foundational to effective teaching practice, to building positive learning environments, and also for priorities like student wellbeing. The next step then is to identify which evidence-based practices to address this need are feasible, acceptable, and can be adapted within these Australian schools. And for this, we need stakeholder perspectives. So study 2A explores why certain practices might work in Australian schools and also how they can be implemented and sustained according to education stakeholders. It focuses on three main aims. So firstly, we want to know which of the evidence-based practices from study 1 actually matter in Australian secondary schools based on what stakeholders see as commonly used, important, and feasible. Secondly, we want to know how the Australian school context shapes STRs, including what factors enable or hinder high-quality relationships. And finally, we want to know how schools can best be supported to adopt, implement, and sustain these practices, which directly informs the preparation phase in study 2B. So study 2A primarily involves a multi-stakeholder survey. Based on multi-stakeholder Delphi guidelines, I aim to recruit a minimum of 20 students, 20 teachers, and 5 to 10 participants from additional stakeholder groups. Our school-based participants will be recruited across Australian school sectors, and within each sector, we will aim to recruit from schools with different socioeconomic profiles, so there's more breadth of contextual perspectives. Study 2A will involve matched but separate surveys for adults and students so that the students can have age-appropriate language. And where possible, these surveys will involve closed-ended items followed by open-ended questions. So for example, participants would be able to rate the importance of practices and then explain in their own words their responses. In terms of analysis, for closed-ended items, we will calculate descriptive statistics and cross-tabulations across the sectors to look at context in a non-inferential manner. And for the open-ended questions, we will use reflexive thematic analysis to identify some patterns about determinants, supports, and strategies. Moving into the preparation phase, study 2B aims to integrate the international evidence synthesized in study 1 with the stakeholder input from study 2A to develop a clear, logical, and well-specified implementation plan. This primarily involves follow-up focus groups with adult participants from study 2A who consent to follow up. The content of the focus groups will be informed by prior studies, but in general, they will focus on consolidating a final set of practices into a practical toolkit, generating some practical recommendations for adapting and implementing these practices, also defining an implementation framework of these contextual determinants, supports, and strategies, and finally looking at how we can measure implementation in schools. So as a final overview, this project aims to integrate evidence and practice perspectives on how we can improve STRs and then funnel this information out to stakeholders who might actually benefit from the work. Study 1, 2A, and 2B are triangulated such that they move from evidence synthesis to stakeholder consultation to co-design of practical resources for improving STRs in Australian secondary schools. Briefly, in terms of the research timeline, I'm planning to start screening for study 1 this month, and we've also started on some of the documents for the study 2 ethics. Throughout the timeline, I've built in some longer buffers so we can accommodate for longer ethics and recruitment processes throughout study 2 without delaying the overall project too much. Yeah, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Well done, Tegan. I'll hand over to Tara. Take over the Q&A.
Great job, David. Let's take some time. Really clear presentation. That was really, really well done. I've got a couple of questions and then I might invite questions from the panel. Let's find questions from the rest of you. So can you give some examples of what you're imagining these intervention practices would look like? That's, well, oh yeah, you're not an easy to read, that's like, it's almost like how we are.
So I didn't get into too much detail with it, but basically that prior meta-analysis qualitatively categorized these practices and had a list. They didn't look at it quantitatively, so it's kind of just like a descriptive, these were involved in effective programs.
Mhm.
So distilled to this kind of level, these are the practices that we might expect to be involved in programs.
Yeah, and so then what does that look like in terms of an intervention? So you're imagining that these practices become things that teachers need to be taught, or I mean, some of these are probably, the model that you use, but they're like further out on the circle, so they would require changes at the school level, for example. Is that kind of what you're imagining intervention would look like?
So for the scope of the project, we wouldn't be designing an intervention.
Okay.
It's more about having a practical toolkit of these practices that actually work for context. So we will take them from programs in itself. So if it happens to be that there is an existing program that has a lot of the things that work really well, then perhaps in future research, that's what you would prioritize. But at this stage, it's more about what things work well for the context, if that answers your question.
Yeah. And then my other question, I'll be very interested in that statement. You mentioned a bunch of sort of potential moderators for the meta-analysis. When I think about sort of naively, because this is not my area, student-teacher relationships, I would have thought that there's quite a strict ceiling there, in the sense that students and teachers develop a relationship up until a point of sort of closeness, and then it's hard to go past that. And some teachers are going to already be quite adept at doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so their ceiling is already kind of set,
Mm-hmm.
and an intervention will have no effect. And so when you run an intervention with them, it's not that the intervention is ineffective, it's targeted at teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if baseline level of STR is an important moderator as a contextual factor. So teachers who are already good at developing STR
Mm-hmm.
do not need interventions to further develop STR. It seems obvious that
Yeah.
it might come out in that.
I mean, I agree with you, but whether that would actually be measured in the intervention studies, I'm not sure, like their baseline skills. I guess half of the, I don't have a slide on it, but the kind of goal of having this practical toolkit is that also we recognize that not all students' relational needs are the same. That's where something like the tiered support systems framework is nice. So obviously there'll be kind of things that might work across the whole classroom or the whole school, and perhaps those teachers that are great at building relationships already do that. But then what happens when there's a student with additional relational needs and they might need a little bit more help? That's when something like the tiered framework is really nice. It's also not like you have to do this. Obviously, we know there's teachers that are doing great already. It's more of like, in the Australian context, we're already telling everybody that STRs are really important. Like, they're good for teaching, they're good for positive learning environments, they're good for student well-being, but we're not actually telling them what to do, or there's no guidance. It's just like, this is prioritized. So it's kind of trying to bridge that gap a little bit more. Yeah.
Tegan?
Right, like I mentioned to you earlier, Tegan, this is a fantastic topic. It's so important to underpin a student's success right from the get-go. I've got a couple of questions about, first with regards to population. And I know it could have been at the start of your CoC documentation, you specify secondary students. And then you mentioned for study A, you're going to look at primary and secondary. And then the study 2B, students aren't getting not getting their perspective. And I was wondering if you were thinking of, if they don't have a voice and there doesn't seem to be apparent evidence, were you maybe considering getting their perspectives in that focus group setting? Or
So the focus on adult stakeholders in 2B was more of like a feasibility thing. I'm not sure if we'd be able to have the students do a follow-up. It's more like that, because we also wanted to do it across school sectors. So I think like the Sarah ethics will take forever, and I thought it would be harder if I did a follow-up, you know? So that was more of a feasibility thing. In terms of study 1 having primary and secondary, there's actually quite little secondary research at the moment. So I thought like we have to kind of have primary and secondary so we have more to draw from. But yeah, for student voice, then that's why I thought secondary schools would be best moving forward. They're the best kind of population to articulate their perspectives. So yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, that helps answer that question. I did have a question about asking if you could put a diagram in just for my brain. So this is great. You've actually done exactly what I was hoping you'd do. And then the other question was with that, and look, I could get the name wrong, but that developmental systems, like did you, because when I look at that, it kind of reminds me of Bronson Brenner's. Did you ever consider maybe using that one?
So it's pretty much based on socio-ecological model. Just like I think it was Robert Pianta kind of applied it more to the STRs more specifically. So, you know, it's like a lot kind of narrower than Bronson Brenner's, which I thought was useful for like this kind of level of stuff. Yeah.
And just one other point, this is fantastic, your presentation is fantastic. This is just me kind of looking at it through logistics eyes. With regards to your time planning and more particularly study 2 and breaking up study 2A and 2B, I think just because the thing is, you know, when you start to do a PhD, time can just go past really quickly. And I would recommend that you maybe break down, especially at study 2B, because it doesn't seem to be that real explicit. I'm going to, you've got the focus groups, but then, you know, what happens after that? Do you disseminate the, you know, or to then kind of, so I think what you're saying is you're going to have this almost like a repository where schools can say, well, look, this is our context, this is our issue. What is the implementation plan that would actually probably best?
I mean, that's better than what I was thinking. But yeah, I get what you mean. So like designing the actual output part.
Yeah, well, just kind of highlighting how you're breaking that down, because then it'll help with your head noises later on when you just think, oh God, why didn't I just put that down? But maybe that's just my, you know, need to be controlling. But yeah, that feels fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bridge.
Yeah, great presentation. It was very clear, and you can see that you guys put a lot of work into this. My question is around the toolkit. Super great, practical, amazing. That's what we want from research. So I know you're going to consult focus groups about that.
Yeah.
But do you have like an envision? Like, how do you envision? What is it going to look like? Like, how are you going to reach those target populations that actually need to use it?
Yeah, I don't know. The dissemination, I think, is going to be the hard part. But so like there's kind of other programs that have used the EPIS framework. So like that's a nice layout for me to know what you put in a plan. So there's like examples of a plan with the kind of toolkit and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question very well. But I'm not sure yet. I in my heart, I kind of feel like there's going to be a program similar to what's going to work really well, if that makes sense. So like, I don't know, like it's really hard to determine at this stage what I think. But I don't know, I've read some that I really like that consider implementation, and I would imagine that our results might look similar to something like that. So the people that have actually intentionally thought about implementation in their intervention. Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's going to be, again, early stages, and you're going to have a focus group, I'm sure, which you're going to talk to the target audience about how you actually get your toolkit to the people who need to see it. And so is this going to be something like just online? Like, is it going to be, or is still,
I don't know. I think like that half the consultation is like with the actual stakeholders being like, where do you want it?
Yeah.
Like, how is it going to be most accessible to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. That's good. And my other question, which you've already touched on it, is to do with like timelines. Recruiting is very hard. Recruiting teachers and students is also very hard. Keeping that in mind as well, you've got the CRM ethic applications. I'm glad that you said that you put in wiggle room for yourself if things take longer. But that is just something that I would recommend just to pay close attention to, is being able to give yourself time to recruit those people that you need. Have you thought about what you're going to do in situations where, because obviously you need to get a lot of different stakeholders' perspectives.
Mhm.
Have you thought about situations where you might miss a key group, that you might not be able to recruit certain schools from lower socioeconomic places, or?
Yeah. I mean, like the ideal is not that, but I don't know. I think at a minimum, like I really just want to have the student and teacher. It'd obviously be a limitation if we didn't have more diverse socioeconomic profiles of schools and stuff like that. But I think in general, like the lack of student data was really crazy to me. So as long as I have like some sort
A
of
nice starting
student voice,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it'd be informative. So hopefully.
Great, yeah, awesome.
Thank you, Rach. I got a couple of minutes, so opening up to the audience. Questions?
I'll ask one more quick question.
sure.
actually. So if I'm envisioning what you're describing correctly, you're looking at the literature more in depth than has been done previously to understand the intervention components that are known to work based on contextual factors, yada, yada, yada. Is there not a risk that you find that there are no intervention strategies that can't be done? Like, I guess what I'm wondering, I'm just like, I'm not for a thesis under the bus or anything like that. All I'm trying to understand is that there is a scenario in which the toolkit is made up of strategies based on sort of focus groups and maybe a little bit of what the meta-analysis tells you might work. But behavior change is really hard. And the only way to know that these strategies work is to rigorously testing in double-blind RCTs. And I actually think that one of the key bits of information we pulled out that seems really insightful to me is that if all of these interventions were measured against teacher perspectives, teachers were the targets of the intervention, they cannot have been double-blinded. And so we know that their intervention results are likely skewed already. Is there not an element of you that kind of wants to test some of these strategies, make sure that they work? And
Yeah.
test that they work?
I did, but we were kind of like given the scope of how long I have to do everything, and the fact that I really think you kind of need to plan more for this research to practice gap. It's not going to happen in this project. I would love to do it after, but I just think given like the timeline of everything, probably not. Yeah.
Following up what Sharon was saying, for me, you're building an intervention and then not testing it.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, that seems to me to be a problem. The other issue is that I'm not sure that the focus groups are going to tell you what works. They might tell you strategies for implementation. But I've found with interventions that the best way to figure out what works is to do pilot studies and to let the intervention build from that. It just worries me that you don't even, a big random control trial is clearly beyond the scope, but would it be possible now? It's beyond the scope, but what I would like to see, maybe it's beyond the scope, is that at least a pilot study to test it out in a single school.
Yeah.
Not with an RCT, just a test of the implementation.
I agree. I don't know how the feasibility is my concern again. Because I don't even know how we kind of have to get rid of something if we wanted to do like a pilot trial. And I don't know in my brain what to get rid of is kind of my concern. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's also a matter of priorities,
Yeah,
which is most important. Problem I have is that you're going to come up with an intervention that's totally untested. Maybe this is your postdoc, whatever. But the credibility of all this good work is questionable
yeah, okay.
at the end of your thesis.
Yeah, I get your point.
We did initially want to have a pilot trial, but then looking at the scope of the first study as well, which would be a massive quantitative and qualitative synthesis. And then having the focus group sort of looking at the implementation and then also testing it just was not as brilliant as Tegan is. She did like 2 massive studies in honors. Yeah. In terms of time and money and resources, I think even between honors, very good.
And you remember we've been at this one before with that, like, just doesn't work. If you do a big synthesis like Tegan is doing, it's almost impossible to actually get a high quality pigment pilot. So I think her focus is just, it's not the focus you like, you want the whole thing, but she's focusing on the first part and the pilot will be her postdoc.
I think it's
Yeah, correct, postdoc, just like that, you've got a project going. All right, so cognizant of time, so before we just say thank you to Tegan, just a reminder, next week we have a double header, Ying and Emma doing their CSCs as well. So Belinda, can I just ask you to stay on the line shortly? I'm just going to transfer you over to the panel discussions, which is a closed session. And to everybody else, thanks very much for your time coming, and please give another hand to Tegan. Well done. All right, thank you everyone.
Okay.